Well, thank you very much for being here. For those who are not in the class, I'm Nicolas Kaiserbril. I'm a data journalist. I've been a data journalist since 2008 approximately. It's been 10 years. I live in Berlin, Germany, and I worked in Paris, France before that, where I was born. And I would like to take the time tonight to discuss what data journalism has done in the past 10 years. And since most of you are training in data journalism, it might be interesting to reflect together what data journalism will be in the coming years, now that the hype around data journalism is over. But before, let's go back to the concept of data journalism. You probably know it from studying it, but still my favorite definition comes from these slides. They are very old. They are from a 2010 presentation by someone who was at the time at the New York Times. And what this person said was that the old journalist-developer relationship was like this, that the developer was working somewhere in the newsroom and the journalist was working somewhere else. And I can testify that this was the case 10 or 15 years ago when I started working as a journalist. In one internship I did in 2005, for instance, I was with the internet people in the basement, and the journalists were like 2 floors up in the newsroom. So there was really a discrimination against technical people. And what happens with data journalism is this: you just put developers and journalists together, and then data journalism happens by itself, just by having the 2 skills together. And what was in this presentation by this person at the New York Times in 2010, there was a third slide, which was this. It was journalism saved. And this person was saying that just by putting developers and journalists together, working on the same desk, you would save journalism. And obviously, if you've been following the news in the past 10 years, you know that this did not happen, that journalists wasn't saved just by having developers and journalists work together. And I'd like to take the time tonight to think about why this did not happen, and what did happen and what did not happen. And if you have any remarks at any time, don't hesitate to make them heard. So going back to what data journalism is, as I just said, the whole idea is to have journalists and technologists, so mostly developers, working side by side, and the goal is to produce new products and tools, so to create new content, to reorganize the news organization, to reorganize the newsroom around data, and to improve journalism. What I mean with that, so produce new products, to invent new products is perhaps the easiest idea. Instead of writing articles, when you have technologists working with journalists, you can invent many things. I just saw there was a virtual reality hackathon, for instance. That's exactly the kind of things that you can do when you have storytellers working with developers. You use drones to produce journalism, you use computers, you use big data, you use whatever you can just to tell stories. And you can only do that if you have developers in your team. The second goal may be broader, to improve journalism. You're certainly aware that most journalists are not extremely happy to work with numbers, and this causes problems when they misinterpret numbers. And with data journalism, because data is so present, there is this idea that by using the scientific method to produce journalism, we'll be able to produce better journalism than before. And again, we'll see if that was the case. And finally, perhaps the most ambitious plan of data journalism, when it was first thought about 10 or 12 years ago, was to shift from an article-centric worldview in the newsroom to a data-centric worldview. The article-centric worldview is maybe easy to understand. You have articles, you produce articles, you put them in a database, and then you have one article on top of the other, and it just goes on and on and on, and you just produce articles as was the case on print. With an information-centric or a data-centric worldview, you change the perspective. Instead of producing articles, you aim at producing data, and the core of the organization will be a database that contains all the information this organization gathers, and articles will be produced as needed. One organization that works like this that you probably know is Bloomberg. Bloomberg is just one big database. They rent terminals to traders and other people, and the people who have the terminal can access all the information that Bloomberg has all of the time. And on top of this information, on top of this database, Bloomberg also writes articles. They have a TV station. They have many different products, but the core is the database. And when data journalism started 10 years ago, the idea was that all newsrooms could transform into small Bloombergs on different topics. And this did not happen, and the question is why. So, as I said at the beginning, things did not work as planned. So, for instance, you probably know that most newsrooms are still not very good at working with numbers. This is an example from a few weeks ago in the United States. It's not a political topic. It's just a pure mistake, no manipulation here. They tried to make a line chart, which is probably the easiest thing possible, and they got it wrong because they just plotted the dots randomly. The dots have nothing to do with the values. You see here, you have 85, which is exactly at the same point on the chart as 103. Something is wrong here. And they didn't see it. They showed it live on TV without anyone noticing that it was wrong from the person who created the chart. Maybe this person made a mistake, we don't know. But then you probably have someone who oversees the whole edition, and then you have the presenter. So you have the whole chain of command in the newsroom that was not able to spot a very, very easy problem to see. So this was in the US a few months ago. We had the same thing in Germany just last week. I don't know if you can read here, or if I can open that. There was a press release from the police in Berlin, and the biggest newspaper in Germany called Bild got every number wrong. What the press release... Oh, sorry for that. Well, I'm going to read it. What the press release said was that there was a certain amount of crimes per capita per year, and what the journalists wrote was they took this number per capita per year and they turned it into an absolute number per day. So they basically got it absolutely wrong. And again, you have to think at the chain of decisions in a newspaper. It's not just one journalist getting it wrong. I mean, it can happen to make a mistake, but then you have someone who reads the article, you have someone who validates the article, you have someone who prints the article, and you have to see that all of these people did not see the mistake. So that's not really great for data journalism, because it means that one of the goals of data journalism, which was to make sure that the newsrooms would be more data literate, this goal was not achieved, or not, or we did not go far enough. Another aspect, another thing that did not happen was the transformation of the newsroom. You might remember I said that one of the goals of data journalism was to transform the newsroom from an article-centric worldview to a data-centric worldview, to turn each newsroom into a small Bloomberg. And obviously this did not happen. If you go to the homepage of the New York Times or any newspaper, you'll see that you still have many articles that are produced every day by journalists, and the articles go on and on, just like they did on print. And you don't have any newspaper that radically transformed itself to become a database that was serving clients. But what's even more interesting, I think, is that this transformation did happen if you look at classifieds and ads. Classifieds are the small ads that you see in the newspapers when you want to sell something, when you want to rent a flat, when you want to post a job offer. You give that to the newspaper, and the newspaper runs the ad, and then people call you. These classifieds business was the largest part of the newspaper business in most countries. I don't know about Russia, the situation is probably different here, but in most countries in Europe and in the United States, the classifieds business was the biggest business of the newspaper. That was the biggest part of the revenues. And what's interesting to notice is that this business was completely transformed in the past 10 years. I don't know if you're old enough to remember when, to find a flat, for instance, you had to buy a newspaper and look at the classified ads. It was probably the same in Russia. Well, no one does that anymore, right? Now you go online, you go on a website where all the ads are, and it's perfectly normal. It's the same thing if you want to buy or sell your car, if you want to buy or sell anything, if you want to find a job, you're not going to buy the paper and look at the classifieds ad. And what's interesting to notice is that almost every newspaper transformed its ad business radically. They either dropped their classifieds activity, or they created startups, or they bought startups. And now most media groups have their own online classifieds business, and they don't run it the way they used to. So they were able to radically transform one part of their business, but they left the newsroom as it was, which is, again, an interesting contradiction. Why did they turn their classifieds business into a data-centric business and left their information business as it was? So why was it the case? That's the question. So yeah, no newsroom revolution. You probably know that the way journalism education works has changed little, again, over the past 10 years. Most of you in a data journalism masters. I think there are 5 data journalism masters in Europe right now. You are one of these. There's one in Madrid, one in Gothenburg, and that's about it. So again, the way journalists are trained hasn't really changed, and the way journalists work hasn't changed either. And if you go into any newsroom in Europe right now, you'll find that, well, most journalists have no idea what HTML is. And I'm not talking about JavaScript or machine learning. you won't find many people who know what that is in European and American newsrooms. And I assume Russian newsrooms as well. And what's even more interesting is that the way most journalists think hasn't changed either. That's why I wrote, most journalists also don't know what they don't know, which means they don't know that they don't know HTML. They don't understand why it's important to know HTML to do journalism. And the reason in this master's, I assume you know, that if you're going to work all your life with content that's going to be displayed to the user in HTML, it might be a good idea to understand what HTML is. If you're going to work your whole life with computers, it might be a good idea to know the basics of how computers work, which again is what you do in this master's by learning Python and JavaScript. So data journalism has been here for 10 years, but there was no newsroom revolution. Again, it's one of the failures of data journalism. The question is why this did not happen. On the other hand, we can look at what did happen over the past 10 years, the successes of data journalism, and there are many. Obviously, you probably know that there were several mega leaks in the past decade. The process was started by WikiLeaks in 2010 with the Afghan war logs. That was when WikiLeaks was given a database of events that had happened in Afghanistan with the NATO armies. And they analyzed the database with different journalists from different media outlets to produce stories. And that was the first time that the heart, the core of the story was a database. And to analyze it, they needed to do data journalism in the sense that they needed to have technologists, they needed to have developers work together with journalists. So that was the first time in 2010 that this happened. After that, I don't know how old you are, but you might remember, there was the Iraq war logs, which was again a WikiLeaks project, and there was the Cable Gate, when WikiLeaks released cables from the State Department. And after that, WikiLeaks ran into trouble. But what was interesting is that the methodology that WikiLeaks developed in 2010 was reused by another consortium of journalists, by another organization. This organization is called ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And they reused the methodology to produce the offshore leaks in 2013, Panama Papers last year, and Paradise Papers this year, which I assume you heard about, right? If you look at these leaks, if you look back at these leaks, something that's interesting for me, for this presentation, is that the first few leaks, there was a lot of talk about the leak in itself, about how amazing it was that journalists would be working together, analyzing gigabytes or terabytes of data. But there was almost as much talk about the leak itself than about the stories of the leaks. And if you look at the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers, the last two, it's interesting that there was not much talk about the leak, but much more about the content itself. And what I mean is that the leaks have become normal. We expect them. ICIJ even said that now they're going to do one investigation per year. So they're going to keep working with the same methodology, so bringing journalists around the database. They're going to do that regularly once every year. So that was for the big investigations. But what's even more interesting, what's even more normal, is that many different organizations are doing exactly the same thing. You might know the European Investigative Collaborations. It's another network, just like ICIJ. And they did investigations such as the football leaks, Does that ring a bell? No. If you like money and football, it was a really interesting investigation. So you see here the partners of this group. I don't think they have any partner in Russia. And the projects that they did, you have several that are listed on their websites. So the Football Leaks was very similar to the Paradise Papers and Panama Papers. They received a dump of documents, mostly emails from football agents, and they were able to investigate how money was flowing in big name football clubs. For instance, they were the ones who showed that Lionel Messi was hiding money offshore, I think. So again, a big story, and you see they had other investigations, again following this idea of one database, a group of technical people working together on an investigation. So that's for Europe, and in the United States you have the same thing going on. There in the United States, the biggest player is called ProPublica. Do you know them? Yeah. So ProPublica is a non-profit newsroom that was created also 10 years ago, and they did projects such as Electionland for the US election. What they did in this case was to bring a whole lot of people together, a whole lot of journalists together. They had something like 200 journalists working together on election night, and the idea was again to create a big database of everything that was happening on election night, and get articles, get stories from this common database in real time. Another interesting project that they are doing is called Documenting Hate. They also do that with dozens of local newspapers across the United States. The goal in this case is to create a database of hate crimes in the United States because no one is monitoring them. So by having this database, they want to create the biggest, the largest, the most up-to-date resource on a topic and share that with other. So that's how it looks like. And they want to share that with other journalists. So again, the same methodology, one central database, several journalists working around it. And you have other examples that I'm not showing here, but basically it has become normal. You now have dozens of journalists working in such organizations. And to work on such stories, many different newsrooms across the world have been building data journalism teams between 3 and 10 people. At the New York Times, they're much more than that, but they're an exception. And these teams have journalists, project managers, developers, designers, sometimes a statistician, sometimes a drone person, sometimes a virtual reality person, all working together to create new forms of content or to work in these huge international investigations. Again, I'm just showing you a few examples of Germany because it's the country in Europe where which is the most advanced in data journalism. This is an example of what Zeit Online did. Zeit Online is one of the biggest German news websites, and this project just won one award yesterday in Germany. And what they did is challenge the users to check their stereotypes of people who live in the countryside. And the way this piece works is basically asking questions. What it says here is it's asking you a question. Do you think it's true or false that people in the countryside meet their friends more often than people in the city? I think it's true. And it's not true. People in the city meet their friends more often than people in the countryside. But my point with this is it's a perfect example of what data journalism is about. You have a database, in this case, a lot of statistics about things that happen in the city and in the countryside. You have a new way of telling the story. Instead of writing an article on paper, they made this interactive article where you actually have to answer questions to go further in the article. And this is quite successful with the public. You have many different other examples. Another project from Berlin, which was also very successful, is this map, where they put side by side the map of Berlin in 1953 and the map of Berlin today, and you can just explore the map as if it were a Yandex map or a Google map. You can just zoom in and out and look at your own street as it was after the war and as it is today. And what's interesting about these examples of the Morgan Post, so this one and the previous one in Sight, is that this has become totally normal. They do such projects every week or more than every week. And you find the same things in France. You have one or two teams in France and in the United Kingdom. This is an example by the data team at the Financial Times. Here, they made a huge project that was also extremely successful. They did an investigation on Uber, the taxi service, and instead of writing an article, they created a game. So in this game, you have to play someone who is on Uber, and then you have to make decisions. So here is, you start on a Monday morning, and you're getting your first ride, and you have the choice of either calling the person you're supposed to pick up or just wait, and you have to manage your ratings and your money and your family. And what's interesting is that it feels like a game, like any game, but behind it there is an investigation. There are journalists who actually went on the ground talking to Uber drivers to understand what their situation really was, and then they converted this investigation into a game instead of writing an article or of making a video or anything else. So again, an example of using technology, using developers to tell stories differently, and this is very successful. This has become the new normal in these newsrooms. And when you don't have when you don't have a dedicated team, you often have individuals who are pretty good at what they do. They obviously are not as good as a team because no one is good at everything. But you have a few examples of people who are doing data journalism as individuals. In Russia, there is this Ivan Golunov, which you might know, who did, for instance, an investigation on the public procurements in Moscow that was published in Medusa. And it doesn't look as good as the previous example I showed, but the way he worked is quite similar. Again, it's building a database, analyzing it, making a story out of it. And there are no limits to what you can do when you work with technology and journalism. This is an investigation from 2 or 3 days ago in Berlin, Germany. What this journalist did is he worked with scientists to measure pollution in Berlin, and together with the scientists they put sensors everywhere in the city, I think 100 sensors, and they measured pollution in Berlin, and they showed that the pollution in Berlin was much, much worse than what the government was saying. This is what the buzzword for this is called sensor journalism, because they use sensors, but it's really just technology people working with journalists. And when you have no teams and no individuals that can do the work, you often have agencies that fill in the gap. In Russia, there is one such agency called Media Gun in St. Petersburg. They recently did an investigation about the state of roads in Siberia, for instance. I don't know if you saw that. No? It's a pretty good investigation from what I could read on Google Translate. They looked at all the state of the roads in 5 different cities in Siberia, and then they looked at how public procurements worked in these cities. And by merging these two databases, or by looking at these two databases, they were able to understand how the road repair business was going in Siberia and what was wrong and what could be improved. And you have different such agencies in different cities. In Stockholm, you have an agency called Journalism++, which I co-founded 6 years ago. Kiln in London, which often works with The Guardian, or Pitch Interactive in San Francisco. What's interesting is that all of these different organizations, from the newsrooms to the agencies, work together. This agency in San Francisco, for instance, worked together with ProPublica on this election land project. They did the interactive map. So there is an ecosystem that appeared around data journalism. You have many people who do it, but it did not. It was not a revolution in journalism. So something happened, but not exactly what was supposed to happen. So that's it for what happened in the past 10 years. So I said at the beginning that what was hoped for with data journalism didn't really happen. What happened is that we have this small ecosystem in much of Europe and the United States, where we have people, we have teams, we have agencies that do data journalism. Some projects are great, some projects are game-changing. If you think of the Panama Papers, for instance, it had a huge impact, and it happened only because of data journalism. But at the same time, it remains a small niche. And now I wanted to finish by looking at what's the future of data journalism for next year and probably the years after that. And that's probably most interesting for you because you're going to be looking for jobs as data journalists in the next few months. So the first trend for the future of data journalism is probably that it will remain an important niche, it will remain an important small community, because high quality content is in demand and will remain in demand in the future. If you think of the models based on page views only, I'm thinking about BuzzFeed, for instance, which you probably know. So a typical website that was built only to get as many page views as possible. Well, in the last 2 years, BuzzFeed invested a lot on quality content. They created BuzzFeed News, and they hired a lot of journalists, and they hired a lot of data journalists. So this trend will probably continue because there is no more money in high volume content. It's become harder and harder to make money by just page views because basically Google and Facebook have been getting all the advertisement money. So there is there is no more money available for other media outlets, so they have to find something else, and this something else is to increase the quality to be able to reach other advertisers that will not go to Google and Facebook. So as I just said, data journalism teams are good at producing high-quality content. Just think of the example I just showed, the Uber game, the map of Berlin, the small games. That's something that you can only do with data journalism, so expect more teams, bigger teams in the future. The other reason why data journalism or data journalists will probably not go away from newsrooms anytime soon is because the data journalism teams can also develop in-house tools. In the last 10 years, there were many startups that were created to help journalists. Carto, which we're using this week for maps, for instance, or Infogram for charts. They were created with journalists in mind, and step by step, they're moving away from journalists because they realized that there was no money to be made from journalists. They're moving into business intelligence, they're moving into catering to state agencies, and as a result, it's becoming harder and harder for newsrooms to get the tools they need from other companies. So there is a trend that newsrooms are developing their own tools, whether it is for data visualization or also to analyze traffic, for instance, or to do any tasks where developers are needed. So again, another reason why data journalists will still be in demand in newsrooms in the future, even if the newsrooms have not been totally transformed. What will probably not happen in the future, as I said, is that the newsrooms will not turn into data hubs. They will not turn into small Bloombergs. And the reason for this is not that it wasn't a good idea. The reason for this is that they missed the opportunity. Now, if you look at different verticals, at different topics, you'll find that there are companies providing data, but these companies are not newsrooms. The most obvious example is a company called Opta Sports. I don't know if do you know it? No? Opta Sports is a company that has data on every game of every sport all around the world in real time. If you have read data about a football game recently, chances are the data was from Opta Sports and was sold to a newspaper or to a TV station so that they could display the results themselves. And what's interesting is that Opta was created in 2001, and in just 15 years they went from a small startup with very little money to become the largest provider of sports data. And what's interesting is that it was not ESPN, it was not any of the sports media outlets that became this data hub for sports data, even though it would have been easier for them to become this. Another example of this is Skift, another website which specializes on travel data, and you can probably find similar data suppliers, data providers on different verticals. Sometimes media companies do try to create databases on specific topic. I mentioned documenting hate in the United States, where they try to create a database of hate crimes. The problem with newsrooms is that as long as they don't make it a priority to collect data and to create databases, they will not be credible and they will stop collecting this data. This is an example from India, where the Hindustan Times, which is the biggest quality daily in India, tried to create also a database on hate crimes. And what's interesting and a bit sad is that after a few months, the project was discontinued. No one really knows why, probably for political reasons. So it's hard for newsrooms to do these projects in the long term. The only long-term project that I know of a newspaper or a media organization building a database and maintaining it over several years is this project by the Washington Post called Fatal Force, where for the past 3 years they measured how many people were killed by the police in the United States. But it's an exception rather than a rule. Finally, what will also have an impact for data journalism is the end of net neutrality. I don't know what's the legislation on net neutrality in Russia. You know what net neutrality is? So you probably know that tomorrow the FCC in the United States will vote to repeal it, and this will have tremendous consequences for the internet, because most countries right now do not have net neutrality. I mean, it's the case in the European Union, where you will find internet service providers selling you subscriptions where you have only Facebook or only WhatsApp or only YouTube, but it's quite rare. As soon as the United States go in the direction of no net neutrality anymore, expect most other countries to follow, and this will have tremendous consequences, because so far, if you followed, you've seen that quite a big chunk of data journalism was done by agencies or by small newsrooms. If you remember the project about the roads in Siberia, it was not published by a news organization. It was published by Transparency International, which is a fairly small NGO in Russia. And chances are these small players will not have the money to pay for a fast lane internet access, so they will have less traffic, which means they will have less money, which means they will have less incentive to do data journalism. Even though I'm expecting a large media organization to keep hiring data journalists, I'm expecting everyone else to stop doing it. So that's it for the trends. And you might ask, just to finish, just spend a few minutes talking about the buzzwords. Data journalism is not a buzzword anymore. It stopped being a buzzword about 2-3 years ago. It was replaced by big data, which was replaced by machine learning, and data viz is still somehow fashionable. So big data, well, if you're a developer, if you're a technologist, or if you're a journalist doing data journalism, it's easy to do big data when you need to. The tools are not extremely complex, and a good example of that is what ICIJ does when they have databases that are in the with millions and millions of documents. They have to use the tools of big data, such as Neo4j, which is a graph database, Apache Solr, which is a software to index huge database, and obviously they do tasks in parallel. I don't know if that rings a bell, parallelization. Basically, when you have to do a huge task, let's say search across millions and millions of documents, if you do that on your laptop, it's going to take a long time. So then you have two solutions. Either you buy a super computer, but it's going to cost a lot of money, or instead of having just one computer doing the task, you do it on like 10 computers at the same time. This is parallelization, because the tasks run in parallel. So you have to set up your computers in a special way. That's the basic thing you do with big data. And again, it's not rocket science. Any good computer programmer can do it. And if you are a data journalist, you know where to find the programmer that will do it for you. And again, most of the data journalism projects that I showed so far did not require any big data tool. The data fit on a spreadsheet. So you'll be able to do them. The other buzzword, machine learning. Again, I'm assuming you're familiar with the term. Machine learning is the idea of using neural networks to find patterns in data or to predict future behavior. You have one major example of this, which is called the tennis racket, an investigation by BuzzFeed News, which I mentioned already. And what they did in this case is they scraped a lot of data from betting websites, and they looked at suspicious patterns on betting websites when it came to tennis matches. And the hypothesis was that there was a network of criminals who would pay tennis players to abandon a game when the odds were especially bad against them. So if you bet against a player and this player abandoned the game, you would make a lot of money. So they did machine learning on this betting data set, and they found that 15, I think, players, where is it? Anyway, they found that 15 players were especially suspicious, and that it was evidence of this criminal network that was manipulating tennis games. Another example of that is, again, this project by ProPublica, Documenting Hate, where they do machine learning to analyze all the documents they have in their huge database. And what's interesting in these two examples is that it doesn't work. On the tennis racket, the list of the 15 players that they had was false. What they found was not crime, was not fraud. It could be explained all of the time. Actually, in this investigation, they did not publish the names of the players that they suspected of wrongdoing, and a team of students then did the same investigation and found which player it was, which players were accused of wrongdoing, and for each of them, there was actually a good explanation why they would have behaved in this way. So in this case, machine learning was probably not a good idea. Luckily, they had other sources. I mean, the investigation wasn't bad, but machine learning didn't bring much to the investigation. And on this example by ProPublica, I tried it yesterday, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work as it should, at least. So I'm guessing that machine learning is not helping them in their daily life if the tool that they advertise as the cool machine learning thing doesn't even work. My point with machine learning, if you've read about it, you probably know that the way neural networks work is that you don't really know how they work. You give them training data, you give them the output that you want from this training data, and then the neural net kind of find its way through the data to create the correct output every time. But the problem with this method is that because you don't know how it works, you don't know how it fails. When you have an error in your machine learning algorithm, chances are you have no idea what the error was produced. And that's a big problem when you do journalism, because you cannot, as a journalist, reach a conclusion and say, I have no idea how I found it. The risk of making an error is just too big, and that's exactly what happened to the BuzzFeed example. So machine learning journalism, I don't think is going to be a huge trend. And finally, data visualization. Well, as long as you'll have big data around and machine learning and people being enthusiastic about data, you will have data visualization. and as long as you have data visualization around, you will be able to use these skills, to use these agencies to produce journalism. So I think the data visualization trend will remain, which is probably a good news for you in terms of job prospects, because the skills you're learning now will be useful to data visualization companies. So the future is looking pretty good for people who have data journalism skills. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes.
I watch for job offers for data journalism, and mostly they want either mathematicians or programmer. They don't want like journalists. like.
Yes, that's true. But you are a programmer.
No, they want like a high-skilled programmer.
Yeah, but fake it until you make it. Again, programming. Web programming is easy. You're not doing advanced physics or advanced mathematics. That would be hard. Everything that you need to do to work in a company that works mostly on the web, so such as a newsroom or data visualization studio, all this programming is really not hard. I mean, like really, really. So if you learn the basics now and you keep updating your skills in the next few months or years, you'll definitely be able to work in these positions. I mean, the tools change so much that it's really not about being a good programmer. It's really about being able to follow the trends and to know how programmers work today. Any other question? Thank you.
So, like, we will probably, all of us, we want to make an internship. So, I don't think that there's much internship in Russia. So, how do you think, like, it's possible to go to somewhere to Europe?
Yeah, definitely. As I said during the presentation, you are one of the very few master's programs that mix journalism and programming. So if you go to a newsroom in Europe and say, I know the basics of Python, I know visualization, and I can do journalism, and I speak I don't know how many languages, they will want you. If you manage to get the visa, because they won't help you, then you're probably good to go, and you can try any English-speaking newsroom or whatever languages you speak. And I can help with that if you need contacts. I'll be happy to do so.
Is there opportunities to do like paid internships?
It depends on the countries. In most countries, I think internships are paid. To give you an order of magnitude, in France, it's like 480 euros per month, which is not much. But the rules in journalism is that it's not paid. So it's hard. Sorry. But you should maybe, instead of trying to apply to newsrooms, try to intern in agencies. They probably have more money. They're more flexible. And even if you don't do journalism, you'll learn a lot. And you can make contacts with journalists in whatever city you end up in through these agencies. No problem. Any other remarks? Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Пожалуйста, пожалуйста. Серег, закончили, банду позови, пожалуйста. Да.